Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the wonderful company harvesting health and happiness around the world, California Emerging Technology Fund, and
Fresno State, where bold begins.
The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Era Energy LLC, BNSF Railway, E&J Gallo Winery, and Harris Ranch and Inn. Thank you. From the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. Our guests are Dan Walters with CalMatters and John Myers with the LA Times, and they probably thought they'd just about seen everything in California politics, and then 2020 happened. We're going to find out what they think of the year that was and what it means for 2021. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thanks.
So let me ask you, John, let's start with you. How would you summarize the 2020 legislative session? John, how would you summarize the legislative session, this last session?
I would call it chaotic, and I don't think anybody would be surprised by that. I mean, the legislators were dealing with the exact same things that Californians were dealing with in their personal and their professional lives. As a matter of fact, Mark, I think that the real takeaway was that we learned just how much of governing requires you to be in person and communicating with people better, because so much of the legislative agenda didn't get done because of the public health concerns in Sacramento and at the state capitol, and that they could not find time to meet to coordinate on a lot of things. So I would say it was fairly chaotic. I think there were a lot of things left undone. Certainly the economic conditions of the state, and as a result, the changes they need to make in the state budget were the biggest takeaway. But there were a lot of issues that were left unresolved. And I think when we see them come back in 2021, a lot of these issues, these systemic economic issues that really the pandemic has laid bare, have got to be first and foremost on that agenda, from housing to homelessness to economic prosperity.
So Dan, same question. This last legislative session, what's your impression? What's your takeaway?
Well, before John answered the question, I had the same word pop into my head: chaotic. It certainly was a chaotic session. You might recall that when the pandemic hit, the legislators, you handle it, we're going home. And they stayed home for weeks and weeks and weeks, and finally came back into session, and it was a chaotic summer. Particularly the last night of the session was particularly chaotic, and as John said, stuff was just left undone. Of course, a lot of people would say that's good that they didn't do so much, but nevertheless, there was a lot of stuff undone. I think the most conspicuous casualty, if you will, as being a fairly major bill to aid housing construction, got gobbled up in the last night in a kind of a nasty fight between the houses, the leaders of the two houses, or oddly enough, how to operate during a they had either in person or could do it by computer or whatever, and the whole thing just kind of collapsed in finger pointing and everything on the last night. As you know, they're coming back soon, and they have everything on the agenda that they had a year ago that wasn't answered. As John mentioned, homelessness, the crisis, educational deficiencies. There are a whole bunch of things. Plus, and now layered over that and made worse by is the coronavirus, so the COVID-19 pandemic. It is made all of those issues more acute, more difficult to resolve. And by the way, they won't have as much to spend as they used to have because of the basically shutdown of much of the California economy. So this it was a bad session. And I think everybody would say it was a bad session. And towards the end of it, they were even being resentful about Gavin Newsom having so much power and they being kind of losing out of things. So I'll carry over.
Well, let me ask John a question about kind of ties into this, and that is kind of the tone deafness, it seems like, of frankly the governor and other legislative leaders, whether going to Maui or going to fancy restaurants. Any long-term implications there?
I don't know. I mean, we all know that hypocrisy is the original sin in politics, right? That do as I say, not as I do, and that it leaves you open to being second guessed about the decisions you make for the people that you lead. The governor's attendance at a pricey dinner for a lobbyist friend at an upscale Napa Valley restaurant certainly did not help him. The lawmakers who went on the Hawaii junket, and they go on the Hawaii junket every year, going to a Hawaii junket during a pandemic when travel restrictions are out there or travel concerns are out there certainly didn't look good. I don't know that the legislative one has a staying power. I mean, I don't think that people actually are going to dial into Assembly Member X or State Senator Y. I do think the governor has a tremendous messaging problem right now. And as we're sitting here now, we're talking about, additional restrictions in California that the state might have to impose because of the spread of the pandemic. And is the governor really the best messenger for that? I hear a lot of people around the Capitol wanting this governor to step back and hand over the reins to these online events to his Health and Human Services Secretary or his state public health director, scientists, doctors, people in the healthcare field, and not the politician, because they think his ability to communicate has become limited as a result of all of this. So I do think there is a challenge for this governor in the short term here of getting back on track and getting people to trust that he actually gets what they are living through.
Okay, we're running up against a hard deadline, but up next, we're going to talk about some insightful post-election analysis. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Hepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with John Myers of the LA Times. We had Dan Walters of CalMatters on with us. Unfortunately, we lost the connection. So John has graciously agreed to carry the ball for the team. Thanks, John. So let me ask you about this, about November's propositions. There is what happened in November with the propositions evidence that there's a limit to California liberalism, or is it more evidence that passing propositions really means having the most money?
Well, my feeling always is that there's a bit of a Rorschach test mentality with ballot measures, right? We all see something different when we look at like the results and, what we try to make out of them. I think the following. I think first and foremost, there was not a lot of political oxygen for these ballot measures. And by that, I mean, this was an electorate that was already stressed and exhausted by the pandemic and was focused on a presidential campaign and the challenges that this country faces. And I did not feel a lot of oxygen, or maybe the more appropriate metaphor, given our problems earlier, bandwidth, for voters to really take in a lot of these things. And I think the old adage is true. If you're not sure about it, if you're unconvinced in California, you often vote no. I think that had part of it to do. That said, I do think there were concerns. I think that in particular, Prop 15, which was an effort to change the rules under Prop 13 and to increase property tax payments by businesses, that was looked at as an economic challenge by a lot of voters. I think the voters absolutely believed what the opponents, I should say, of Prop 15 said about that they were concerned about the tax impact and the impact on the economy. A few others, I would say, yes, we could try to kind of.
John, before you jump on those, I want to kind of follow up with you. We're talking about the Prop 15. They're saying that, hey, this shows that Prop 13 is still alive and well in California. But others would say, hey, listen, there were a lot of local bond measures that passed. So maybe it's overstating it to say that, taxes are still the third rail of California politics. I mean, which argument do you buy?
Well, yeah, how you like this, Mark? I buy a little of both. I do think that that those two results seem a little bit inconsistent, except that I would argue that voters, I think, have a tendency, and if you look at the track record, I think this bears it out. They have a tendency to be more supportive of increasing revenues on the local end where they can really see where those dollars are going. And I will tell you that one of my surprises of the Prop 15 campaign, remember, this was a campaign that was put on, a measure that was put on the ballot by teachers, organized labor, a lot of activists who believed, that it's time to rethink the business benefits to Prop 13. But the campaign was almost exclusively, from my viewpoint, about making corporate bad guys pay their fair share. And I'm not saying that's not a good campaign argument, but I didn't see as much of a campaign about where the money would go. And I think you have to show the voters where the money would go. And this would have been billions of dollars for local governments and schools, but I didn't see that communicated as much as I saw making the bad guys pay. And at the end of the day, I think that was kind of a misjudged argument, because ultimately there were a lot of voters that were probably concerned about the economic impact of business taxes.
It seems also that labor kind of took it a little bit on the chin on Prop 22, that the gig measure, where the gig companies won huge, you could say the unions lost huge. Does this portend a kind of a reevaluation of progressive California labor law, or generally, or more specifically, an attack on organized labor?
I think it's really good campaigning, Mark, on the part of the Prop 22 supporters. I mean, first and foremost, but let's not ignore the fact that this was the most expensive ballot measure in American history, not just California history. This $220 million campaign, largely funded by Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and all of those app companies. But at the end of the day, I think that, when you talk to political strategists across the state, what they tell you is they saw that campaign as voters thinking they were helping the drivers. The Prop 22 supporters were adamant that this will help the drivers, which was not false. It just wasn't the entire story, of course, because if the drivers were considered employees of the companies, which is what would happen if Prop 22 had failed, they might be helped more in terms of the benefits, in terms of the workplace protections. But I think this was a campaign where smartly the company said, we're going to make this about the workers, not about us, or the drivers, I should say, not about us. And the voters seemed to buy that. Even the folks who were working on the no side admitted that they thought that made that a very challenging campaign. And I want to point out really quickly that the early polling suggested a lot of undecided voters, but as that massive money machine of television ads and ballot mailers went out, and it was all about drivers, it certainly seemed to move that needle over, and Prop 22 passed.
Yeah, I think also the fact that the former California NAACP chairperson Alice Hoffman was involved in some of those commercials, I think also influenced people that this was, voting for this was voting for workers. In any event, we're going to have more post-election analysis in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with John Myers of the Los Angeles Times about the results of the 2020 election and what it may mean for 2021. So John, regardless of, well, first of all, before I get into the Kamala Harris Senate seat, let me ask you first about just generally Joe Biden and what his election means for California.
Well, I think first and foremost, it means less lawsuits. The state of California has sued the Trump administration now scores of times over a variety of topics, although you really could put them in in pretty simple categories. Healthcare issues, immigration issues, environmental issues. I mean, those are really kind of the big three of what we've sued the federal government over. So first and foremost, those lawsuits ostensibly go away. And we go from a confrontational relationship with our Democratic leadership in California to a friendly relationship, we would certainly think. And Kamala Harris, and we can talk about that in a moment, brings a big factor into that. But already you have seen the president-elect talk about environmental issues, climate change, which is very big in California. And he's talked about infrastructure issues and wanting to do something with that in Washington, assuming he can get it through the Congress. And I think that will play very favorable in California. So I think it's going to be a really interesting relationship. I think if anything, we are probably going to expect more than we're actually going to get. I think this relationship with the vice president-elect makes us think that we'll be able to pick up the red phone and make that phone call anytime. And I think that it's going to be a little bit more complicated. This new administration is going to have its hands full. Well,
I think it is going to be certainly a night and day experience for California versus a second term of President Trump. But let me ask you about the Kamala Harris situation and her Senate seat. It looks like there's some fissures in the state Democratic Party around the appointment. Is this showing some of the fault lines in the California Democratic Party?
I think it shows maybe, but I think what the way I would describe it is I think what it shows is how diverse the Democratic Party is and how undiverse, which is not a very proper word for a newspaper guy, the lack of diversity that we have had in a lot of cases in the top echelons of state elected office through the years. Now, that has been changing over time. Kamala Harris, of course, brought some diversity in 2016 to the Senate, and our statewide offices have become a little more diverse in terms of ethnicity and certainly gender. But I think you see this yearning for more. And first and foremost, you see it out of Latino Democrats who believe that there has never been a Latino in the United States Senate from California, and that this would be a major moment to change that. The real thing here, Mark, is that anyone that Gavin Newsom picks, first of all, there's going to be someone who says, wrong choice. And second of all, this person's going to have to run again in 2 years. Right. And I do think that the governor in whatever decision he makes, is probably going to prioritize people who can win this seat outright on their own in 2 years.
By the way, with him, he's going to be on the ballot too in 2022.
Indeed.
So,
this person's going to reflect back on him in a lot of ways.
Right.
And dare I say it, maybe the governor doesn't want somebody who shines in the spotlight more than he does. I don't know. It's a complicated relationship here, but I do think you see a party that is struggling to make sure that its elected officials and its leaders represent the diversity of the rank and file. And I do think that is part of this discussion.
Well, let me flip the switch a little bit here and talk about the Republicans. They've had some success in the November election, particularly in the congressional delegation. Is it a harbinger for a resurgent California Republican Party?
I certainly think the Republicans hope that, and that's what they're touting at this point. I think primarily we look at that, Mark, in those congressional seats, right? We had a handful of the ones that flipped from Republican to Democratic in 2018, now flipped back to the Republican column. I don't know if that's a harbinger of resurgence as much as it is a stopping the bleeding kind of function there. But all of those congressional seats, and this is the part that I don't think is being talked about enough, all of those congressional seats are subject to change because we are going to redistrict. We are going to change the political maps with the census figures in next year in 2021. And those districts are all going to change. And so we don't really know what the future is going to be for Republicans in finding their niches in the Central Valley and in parts of Northern California and in parts of Orange County and Southern California. They're going to have a lot of work to do in the new districts. And so I would not be tooting your horn too much because it's all going to change when those maps are redrawn in a year or so.
Yeah, great point. Well, up next, we're going to talk about the legislative agenda in the state capitol for 2021. We touched on that a little earlier. We're going to go into more detail in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Hepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with John Myers of the Los Angeles Times. I want to turn our attention to the upcoming political agenda at the state capitol for 2021. So, John, it's been recently reported that the state expects a $26 billion budget surplus. What do you think the governor and the legislature is going to do? Are they going to save it or are they going to spend it?
I suspect at the end of the day, they'll do a little bit of both. I mean, what's really fascinating about this to me is that when you dig into that projection, and that came from the Independent Legislative Analyst Office, of course, when you dig into that projection, what you find is that this is less a story of some kind of like unexpected good fortune as a story about things were not as bad as we thought they were going to be with wealthy Californians. And I mean, California's tax structure has been criticized up and down for years as being too reliant on the wealthy. Well, its reliance on wealthy Californians bailed it out this time because they didn't lose money in this pandemic recession in the ways that we thought they were going to. And so all the solutions that were made in the summertime about the state's budget, most of them weren't needed because the revenues never fell as much. And so this really is kind of a one-time phenomenon. If it turns out to be 26 billion, it could be a little bit more, it could be a little bit less. The legislative analyst says we should put part of it back into the cash reserves. We should use the other on one-time costs. I think that's going to be a strong play. But I also think the biggest play, perhaps, of all of this is schools. The schools took it on the chin in trying to balance this budget. It was $11 to $13 billion of deferred spending on schools, basically telling the schools to go borrow the money and we pay them back later. Mm-hmm. I think this money, first and foremost, is going to be looked at as trying to solve some of those school issues, in addition to being ready for other costs that the state might face as this recession continues.
Yeah.
Certainly,
education.
Californians are going to in a lot of varieties.
Yeah. Education. All right. Always a huge part of the budget. But you said something you reported recently that I found really interesting, and that was you were talking about how confident can the legislature be in these prognostications, these forecasts about the road ahead, because they were so far off by, what was it, $54 billion they were talking about deficit, and now it's a $36 billion surplus or $26 billion surplus. Legislature's going to have a hard time believing that the forecast put out by the Department of Finance. I
certainly think it makes it really tricky. I mean, the forecasting has been tough in the last several years, but this is decidedly so. I think, if anything, Mark, the biggest part out of all of this is the forecasting, yes, but the ability and the willingness to go back in and sample that data more often and come back and make adjustments. One of the things I think was really surprising when the legislature left town in the summertime here in 2020, is that they did not go back and look at those economic forecasts. Those economic forecasts were prior to April, and they didn't even include tax revenues that came in April, because you may remember, of course, we let Californians have a 90-day extension in paying their taxes this year. So the lack of new data, I think, really made that budget out of date pretty quickly. And I think that's the real question, and it has been for the last several years in Sacramento. Should we be getting this economic data more often so that we can make better budget decisions, certainly now in the middle of a very, very complicated and unprecedented recession?
You know, Dan, unfortunately, we lost Dan Walters earlier, but he had written something that I thought was interesting. I want to ask you about. He'd written that new taxes are basically off the table, but the legislative leadership is going to be pressed to spend this quote unquote windfall. That's going to result actually in worse long-term deficits. What that will mean is then some kind of tax hike or some proposal in 2022. Do you think that's the way it's going to play out?
I don't know. I might be slightly less pessimistic than Dan is on that one. I do think that there will be pressures to spend it. I think first and foremost, what people should watch for is the second round of a debate that started in the prior legislative session about ongoing sustained funding for homelessness services in California. There's a group of Democrats that want to spend upwards of $2 billion a year out of the budget on trying to solve California's homelessness issue. I think that'll come back. I think there'll be a lot of pressures there. But at the end of the day, these lawmakers realize that those tax pressures are very hard to deal with, and if they put themselves in that kind of position, that it's a harder sell to their constituents. And we should really point out that there are a number of Democrats in the legislature who come from more moderate, not super liberal Democratic districts, and their votes would be needed if they were going to pass taxes in the Capitol. And going back to the voters with a tax increase seems awfully unlikely to me. So I do think there are a lot of pressures out there. And I think, again, the question here is for the governor. The governor puts out a budget in January. We will see what he is trying to sell this message to be as this pandemic continues.
Yeah, let me ask about the vaccines. In COVID, and we saw a lot of political theater around vaccines in the past at the state capitol. Are we going to see the same thing with the COVID-19 vaccines?
Boy, that's a great question. I mean, that is really kind of the interesting thing. That vaccine debate that we had in Sacramento in years past was all about, these requirements of children getting their vaccinations before they go back to school and having to have them. But it raised a lot of questions of the people who are skeptical of vaccines without any systemic real data to back that up, their own concerns notwithstanding, that's still out there. I think that probably the more pressing part out of this immediately is, what is this review that the state of California is going to do of these vaccines and the vaccine distribution plan? The governor has promised to give more details on that soon and has said he wants to have a role in that. But that is going to be focused on, a lot of people are going to want to watch it because they want those vaccines in the hands of Californians as soon as possible. And so there's a public education campaign coming forward. And I think this is another moment to measure the ability of the governor to keep the trains running on time. And so we'll see.
We are going to be in for another interesting year. I think that's for sure. I want to thank our guest, John Myers with the Los Angeles Times, and the guest we had initially, Dan Walters with CalMatters. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can sign up for the Maddy Daily on our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Institute. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.